What should we do?
How would you respond
in the aftermath of a faith-based nuclear attack?
And not a nuclear 9/11, I guess.
Well, I mean, it seems to me that the faith part is not particularly relevant once the bombs have actually fallen. You may be getting at is just that faith. And this is something obviously that I went into in some detail in my first book, The End of Faith. The problem with otherworldly faith, the problem with the idea that you get everything that you could conceivably want after you die, is that it takes the entirely rational and important motivating component of death out of the equation. So then you can walk around the world meeting people who are in some basic sense eager to die, and they're not bluffing. There are many secular people and religious liberals and religious moderates who think that everybody's bluffing, and it doesn't matter how many people make a suicide video and then blow themselves up. They still think that in some sense you can't trust people's representation of their beliefs. You can't take that at face value. There's always some deeper thing. They've been manipulated, they've been brainwashed, it's politics, it's economics. It's never the faith. I think that faith, the certainty of paradise is intrinsically dangerous. One, because it's very likely false. Right? There's no good reason to believe it. So if you're actually failing to maximize the only circumstance of well-being that you can be certain of. But two, it allows people to do things that would be unthinkable otherwise. And so I do worry about that.
Science is not in principle committed to the idea that there's no afterlife, or that the mind is identical to the brain,
right,
or that materialism is true. Science is completely open to whatever in fact is true. And if it's true that the consciousness is being run like software on the brain and can, by virtue of ectoplasm or something else we don't understand, can be dissociated from the brain at death, that would be part of our growing scientific understanding of the world if we could discover it. Now, and there are ways we could in fact discover that if it were true. The problem is there are very good reasons to think it's not true. And we know this from now 150 years of neurology, where you damage areas of the brain and faculties are lost. And they're clearly, it's not that everyone with brain damage has their soul perfectly intact, they just can't get the words out. Everything about your mind can be damaged by damaging the brain. You can cease to recognize faces, you can cease to know the names of animals, but you still know the names of tools. I mean, the fragmentation in the way in which our mind is parcellated at the level of the brain is not at all intuitive, and there's a lot known about it. And what we're being asked to consider is that you damage one part of the brain and the mind, something about the mind and subjectivity is lost. You damage another and yet more is lost. And yet if you damage the whole thing at death, we can rise off the brain with all our faculties intact, recognizing grandma and speaking English.
I want to hold you to a close scrutiny of this phrase, which I think is a real shocker, and you must have intended it to be a shocker. Most Muslims are utterly deranged by their religious faith. I've even heard you back off a little bit now. You went from most to some significant subset.
Well, no, let me just make it clear. I'm not backing off of that, because utterly deranged by I set the bar rather low for utter derangement. I mean, my lights, thinking that the Quran is the best book ever written on any subject, really, is getting you pretty close to derangement. Thinking that that someone should be killed for criticizing it, or that it's a real problem that cartoonists caricature the Prophet Muhammad and they should be kidnapped. That this is the kind of treading upon the sanctities of the religion is a real social problem that demands more energy in its criticism than suicide bombing. That, I think, is a kind of derangement that is immensely widespread, and we shouldn't minimize it. I think we have to admit to ourselves that we are confronting the behavior of a death cult,
among millions and millions of Muslims, not 10,000 who went to training camps in Afghanistan. We are confronting an endorsement of this kind of behavior and a reflexive political solidarity where Muslims side with other Muslims, no matter how sociopathic their behavior, simply because they're other Muslims. We can't deny the problem while trying to encourage a more benign face of the religion.
When I do see the world this way, it completely undercuts the basis for hatred. I mean, there is no rationale for hating a person. People begin to worry, well, what about all the good moods? I mean, can you still love people while viewing them as part of this vast fabric of causality? And I find that there is no sacrifice to the good stuff. I mean, it's not. First of all, things have to be sort of situationally appropriate. I'm not constantly looking at my daughter thinking about she's just a part of the physical universe and wow, neurotransmitters giving rise to all this cuteness. I mean, that's not the mode I'm in. But even to think in those terms, it doesn't cancel the desire for her happiness. It doesn't cancel. I mean, the love survives the truth. It doesn't. Love is not vulnerable to knowing how things are arising, and knowing how things are arising doesn't nullify all the distinctions about the differences the possible differences in human experience that we care about. We still care about living good, happy, easy, positive lives, and what else could we care about?
For instance, I think at one point you said to me that you either expected or in fact were receiving more criticism with regard to talking to me than talking to Islamists or even
Absolutely,
jihadists.
yeah.
So he could go and talk to a failed suicide bomber, right?
And everyone's happy.
And that's completely legitimate use of his time, and of course we need to have conversations. How else could we move forward? But talking to famous atheists over here, that's as controversial as it gets. And that is of a piece with this liberal or pseudo-liberal criticism that both of us are getting on this topic, where people can't seem to see that, for one, that we're talking about ideas and their consequences. And everything we say about Islam or Islamism or jihadism, or depending on what the focus is, conservative Islam, applies to white converts to the faith, and it applies to people in 100 different countries and of a wide variety of ethnicities. If ever I say something disparaging about Islam compared to Hinduism or Buddhism, well, then that has nothing to do with racism or the colors of people's skin. I mean, racism and bigotry against people based on ethnicity or the country they're born in, that has nothing to do with this conversation at all. And so this meme of Islamophobia that has been thrown up to prevent conversations of this kind is really quite destructive. And it's something that, I mean, the hypocrisy here should be just shattering to liberals in particular, because you have, as Macha just said, we are abandoning the women and the freethinkers and the gays and the public intellectuals and the apostates these are the most vulnerable people on earth in Muslim societies, where you have atheist bloggers, or not even atheist bloggers, just secular bloggers.
People like Raif Badawi.
Getting hacked to death, and liberals are not only not giving them any tools by which to better their lives, they are castigating the people who are trying to shine a light on the disproportionate nature of the problem here. We, the atheist community, is somewhat culpable for this because we're criticizing faith and irrational belief in gods. What I've run into in talking about Islam specifically among atheists is a sense that we're somehow logically committed to being equally opposed to all religions, irrespective of their effects. So to sort of single out Islam from the point of view of atheism is somehow to be co-opted by by bigotry, by an alliance with Christians. But I mean, there's nothing that demands that we not notice the different consequences between different faiths. I mean, anyone who is just as worried about the Amish or about Anglicans as they are about Islam is just reading the wrong section of the newspaper. The question is, do you ever have to believe anything on insufficient evidence to explore this terrain, to become truly...
and what is sufficient evidence?
Well, it's the kind of evidence everyone in this room demands on any subject other than religion. I mean, there are nuances here. It takes a lot of work to rise to the standard of scientific evidence, but science is the one language game we are playing where we get really straight and rigorous about what constitutes evidence, where there's a process of peer review, where you have a lot of smart people trying to prove you wrong, and where you actually win points by proving yourself wrong. I mean, this is not what religions are up to. Religions are not falsifiable in this way. The divine origin of certain books figures rather centrally to Christianity, Judaism, and Islam.
Yes.
This entails a variety of claims which are on their face at odds with science. The belief that Jesus was born of a virgin may be a cherished claim for most Christians. It is also a claim about biology. I mean, this is why you can't keep religion and science apart. Their truth claims cannot be disentangled, which is what you want to do.
I don't want to spend my night defending the virgin birth, but well, they don't think that their body doesn't disintegrate. They assume that it does disintegrate. What they assume is that there is something inside of you that is eternal, which I assume as well.
And
it doesn't seem to me
doesn't
seem to me anti-scientific.
Well, it's anti-scientific if you believe that you have good evidence for that. I mean, this is what's anti-scientific. When your certainty, when your convictions don't scale with your evidence. I mean, I'm actually open-minded on the survival of death. I don't know.
You say about reincarnation that there could even be evidence for it in your book.
Yes, I mean, I can easily tell you what would constitute evidence. I'm not saying this evidence exists, but I mean, I can tell you what would constitute evidence for the truth of Mormonism. It's just not forthcoming. There are all kinds of scientific things you can say about religion, which religious people tend not to want to hear. I mean, you can say, for instance, that Mormonism is objectively less likely to be true than Christianity. Why can you say this? Because Mormonism is just Christianity plus some rather stupid ideas. The variables that Bob wants to invoke here, and again, specifically on Islam, economics and political oppression, don't account for this behavior. The 19 hijackers were living in Germany. They all were college educated. Most of them had PhDs. These are engineers and architects. These people, the Germans were monitoring their conversations. Their apartment was bugged for months before 9/11. All these guys talked about was paradise and the Quran and the evils of infidel culture. Read the book Perfect Soldiers. The problem we have is that we desperately want to believe that everyone views the world the same way, and if we could just moderate our behavior, all of our enemies would disappear. It'd be so much easier to imagine that we made our enemies. There's no evidence for that, no credible evidence for that. And so whenever I hear someone on the left, and again, I am on the left on every relevant issue. I think homosexuals should be free to marry. I think taxes should go up on the wealthy. I think the war on drugs should be declared over. I am left. But when I hear people on the left talk about Osama bin Laden as though he were the Reverend Jim Jones of the Muslim world, and that is a phantasmagorical degree of denial of the obvious. Osama bin Laden could be doing anything else he wants with his life. And the problem we face vis-a-vis Islam is that the version of Islam that he's teaching is is really faithful to the Quran and the Hadith. I mean, you have to split hairs to see what he is distorting, if anything. Now, if he were Amish, or a Jain, or even a Buddhist, it would be absolutely obvious what he is distorting. I mean, you just couldn't make sense of his behavior in terms of his faith. If Michael or I say something derogatory about Islam or Christianity, which seems possible, the response from the other side shouldn't mention quantum mechanics. And it shouldn't reference a notion of God that is so denuded of doctrine as to more or less be synonymous with pure mystery or pure information or pure energy or pure anything. So I wanted to plant a flag there.
There's something called the observer effect, where intention orchestrates space-time events, which we then measure as movement and motion and energy and matter. And addressing Sam, we can have a personal relationship with this intelligence, because we have a consciousness that is part of the sea of consciousness. Rumi, the great Sufi poet, said, you're not just a drop in the ocean, you're the mighty ocean in the drop. And all you have to do is understand the principles of science and understand that you have within you the resources to intuitively grasp this mystery. But one of the things we have to do today, my friends at Caltech, you have given us this opportunity that you have to stop being the jihadists and the Vatican of conservative and orthodox science, which is not relevant anymore.
You asked, Dan, what I meant by woo-woo. That is the very embodiment of woo-woo. Stringing together at a rapid patter of a bunch of scientific sounding words sprinkled in with some spiritual new age words doesn't mean anything. And by the way, scientists are not jihadists here. This is Caltech. We're not jihadists. That was really very unspiritual of you, very un-Deepak of you to say that.
Well, you bring out the worst in me.
Maybe you need to meditate a little bit there. I mean, just take just one example of this. Non-local, quantum effects, we're all connected. No, this is not true. When quantum physicists talk about non-locality and the interconnectedness of things, they're talking about things at the quantum level.
Okay, hold on, Deepak, you spoke for quite some time. The deeper point to make here, and what is...
But I want to address that brain thing that you just said.
Okay, no, you might not have to, because the deeper point here, and this is where the whole style and content of what you're saying is so deeply unscientific, is that there's not a physicist sitting on this stage right now. Okay, I would never be tempted to lecture a room full of 1,000 people at Caltech about physics. I'm not a physicist. You're not a physicist. And basically every sentence demonstrates that you speak on the subject.
I take resentment at your questioning my scientific credentials. In fact, if anyone on this stage is more scientifically credentialed, it's me. I took physics, chemistry, biology. I'm an MD. I'm a neuroendocrinologist. And I want to object to your saying that brain does not obey non-local.
This is a game. And it's a game that is designed for export to people who don't know much science and don't know how science is done. And you missed the point of, I wasn't criticizing your scientific credentials. You're an endocrinologist. You're an MD. You're not a theoretical physicist. You don't see arrogance. I mean, you're about as likely to see real arrogance as you're likely to see nudity at a scientific conference. I mean, this is people are constantly offering caveats and hedges toward what they say. Every statement is couched in, I'm sure there's someone in the room who knows more about this than me, but because everyone is desperate to avoid public embarrassment. Now, this seems to be something you're not doing.
In the absence of a conscious entity, the moon remains a radically ambiguous and ceaselessly flowing quantum soup.
Deepak, that is...
That you have to have a conscious being.
The moon?
Yes.
Okay, listen to the sounds in the room. I'm not a fan of the term atheism. I mean, atheism is a term totally without content. It's like being a non-astrologer. You know? We don't have a word for someone who's not an astrologer. And if astrologers suddenly became ascendant in our society, we wouldn't need to invent non-astrology as a discipline. We could talk about reason and science and evidence and common sense and bullshit and put astrologers in their place. And so it could be with religion.